am majoring in agriculture education at the University.
Sorry, Shelby, can you start that over because it wasn't recording? Now start.
Oops. Oh, what did I do? Sorry, it's okay. So like Judy said, I am Shelby Kittle. I'm currently going to school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm majoring in agriculture education and I'm minoring in entrepreneurship through their Engler entrepreneurship program. I do have my FFA American degree. I was active in FFA all throughout high school. And this year I received one of the scholarships from the Beekeepers of Indiana Association. So like I said a little bit earlier, I've been beekeeping for 7 years now. This will be my 8th season coming up. I've been doing comb honey for the past 7 years. That's actually the type of honey that I got started with. And I apologize because my dog is in the background squeaking his toys. But basically, I didn't want to invest in extracting equipment when I first started keeping bees until I actually knew that I wanted to continue with that. So I did comb honey because it's a lot less equipment intensive and it's more labor and it's uses basic tools around your house basically. So I did a UCare project the summer of 2020 and this is the one that I'm talking about now. And I'm in the process of doing an academic year UCare for the sale of comb honey and what is the best size to market it as. This year, I ended up losing 11 of my 15 hives, and that is the most I've ever lost. But I am planning on getting nukes in early May to kind of increase my numbers from what had happened this winter. I actually run a small business called Shelby's Honey and Products. And this year I ended up getting it licensed as an LLC. And I'm planning on moving my hives to Lincoln, hopefully in the next month before school starts. I work for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Bee Lab. And so I'm helping Sheldon Brummel with the Great Plains Master Beekeeping Program as well. With that, I'm hoping to go out and catch some bumblebee queens again this spring when they come out. And I'm also excited about the queen rearing classes that UNL is planning on hosting this year. So that's lots of fun. So my research topic was basically exploring the role of natural beeswax foundation in producing comb honey and the economic impact for beekeepers with that. And so I just have a little bit of information on the management of honeybees. And so this is a main income source for commercial beekeepers. And a lot of the times it's supplemental income for the smaller scale hobby beekeepers. Both usually produce liquid honey. And so that means there's competition between those two parties. And I'm basically saying that comb honey is more of a specialty or value-added product, and production usually decreases as the beekeeping operation becomes larger. So what that means for small beekeepers is that if you produce comb honey, you're not as directly competing with those big beekeepers, if that makes any sense. So for my research project, my objective was to gather information on how the different amounts of foundation in the frames affect how efficiently colonies draw out and fill comb honey frames. I ended up setting the frames up with full foundation, half foundation, and no foundation. And my hypothesis was that the frames containing a full sheet would be the most productive, and the frames the frames containing either a half foundation or no foundation wouldn't be as efficient. So this project highlights how beekeepers might refine both management and business decisions when creating comb honey. And it's looking at how they can increase their economic profitability with this product. So my hives were located in Ord, Nebraska. Like I said earlier, it's right on the edge of the Sandhills. It's a small town. And so a lot of the area is wildflowers, alfalfa fields. There is corn and soybean. I ran my experiment from June 1st, which is the day that I set up my experiment, to July 20th, which is the last day that I took data, and also I harvested my comb honey. I collected data every 2 weeks between June 1st and July 20th. And, excuse me, I used my 10 strongest hives in my operation, and each of those hives was a standard 10 frame hive body and super. I made sure that they were queen right, and I found the queens and marked them when I went through and compressed them, which I'll talk about later. And all of my bees are a mixture between Italian and Carniolan stock. So for my production setup, I had medium honey supers set up with 3 of each of the treatment frames, which is basically just the frames that I used to do my experiment with, and 1 drawn bottled honey frame because I had 3 different treatments, and in order to fill all 10 spaces, I had an extra space. So I used a drawn honey bottled honey frame to kind of get the bees interested in the super that I had. So each hive had 2 brood chambers that were condensed into 1. And when I condensed them, I used 2 resource frames and then 8 frames of various brood stages. So that's capped brood all the way to eggs. And then I added a queen excluder, and each hive that I used for my experiment had 1 box per hive. And you can kind of see this is my my hives that are set up where they are right now. So for my treatment boxes, each box had 3 of the full foundation, 3 of the half foundation, and then 3 of the no foundation frames, with 1 bottled honey frame in the center. And frames were marked with treatment ID and frame position because I didn't want to move any of the frames while I did my experiment. I just wanted to see what they would do with it if they were kept in the same spot through the entire season. So no positions were reversed, and each hive had a randomized order of frames. So down in the bottom left, you can see the tags that I used to basically write down which boxes I was using. Each of my treatment boxes had one of those tags, and then I also have a yellow calf tag for the hives that I used for my experiment, and that's just how I keep track of hives when I do notes. So it's nothing new to me. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but this kind of darker orange foundation, or this is full foundation, half foundation, and no foundation as I set it up in my experiment. And then these pictures on the very right kind of show the random order that I put it in. So each treatment had a number, and so like that was no foundation, full foundation, half foundation. This one's full foundation, half foundation, no foundation. It's just randomized so that I can make sure that it's not the place in the box that's making a difference with the production. So when I compressed my hives, each hive originally had 2 brood chambers, as shown on the very far left. I would go through and find the queen and whatever frame she was on, and I would set that aside in an extra box I would take out there with me so she wouldn't fall out into the grass. And then the other frames in the hive, I would make sure that there is 1 frame of bee bread or pollen, 1 frame of nectar and honey, and then 8 frames of miscellaneous aged brood. So usually the frame that the queen is on has eggs, or she was laying eggs. And so I just kind of counted that as an egg frame if there was eggs on it. And then I would go ahead and find 2 or 3 capped frames of brood so that I knew that she would have space fairly soon after I compressed the hive. And then the rest I would pick various ages of brood depending on what was in the box. So after that, I would shake any of the remaining frames and I would add a queen excluder and super. And then any of the extra brood frames or resources that I found and couldn't put back in the box, I would take and use them for other colonies that needed it. So now we're on to my results section. Oh, that's better. So here you can kind of see my seasonal wax production. And so basically the full foundation frames average the highest in wax production. As you can see, it's this blue line up here, and it was the highest, it's right there. And full foundation was significantly higher than no foundation, but there wasn't much difference between full foundation and half foundation. And then wax production was significant between collection dates, except between these 2. So between this one and all of these, it was significant, but these 2 were not significant compared to each other. So it basically just means that the most wax production happened in the first half of the season. When I first put the box on, they really started drawing out wax, and you can kind of tell as they went on, they had most of the wax drawn out, and they started using their energy into putting nectar in the cells and capping it and producing honey. So here we have seasonal honey production. And again, full foundation was not significantly different from the half foundation, but it was significantly different from the no foundation. So basically this means is that between full foundation and half foundation, honey production wasn't that much different, which is really interesting. With seasonal nectar production, it's a little bit all over the board, but there is some information that we can glean from this. So as you can see, full foundation, nectar production kind of slowly went down and then it picked back up. And you see this dip towards the end. That means that they are converting the nectar that they collected into capped honey, and I'll show that here. Or wait, I already did that. But you could kind of see how it went up compared, the honey went up later on in the season compared to nectar production. And the same thing kind of happens with the half foundation. And then no foundation is really interesting because as you can see, it took a little bit longer for the bees to basically build up that wax and also to fill cells with honey. So they started out really low and it just took them a little bit longer to get to the point where they were actually collecting nectar in large amounts. And then towards the end of the season, they still had a very high amount of nectar that was left in those frames. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it does have some significance when you go in to try to do comb honey. So with the seasonal food production, this is basically the nectar and honey combined. And you can see that there isn't much difference, again, between the full foundation and half foundation, but there isn't much difference between the no foundation and the half foundation. And I think what happened was that the overall food collection, both nectar and honey, was approximately the same for all of the frames, but the full foundation and the half foundation did a better job of creating capped honey. So if I would have, say, left the frames on a little bit longer, the no foundation probably would have caught up eventually. And so basically, wax and honey production were the most important variables in this experiment. This is basically because when you produce comb honey, you have to have both wax production and then you have to have honey production because it has to be capped in order for you to sell it. If you have too many cells that aren't capped, then your moisture content on your honey is too high and it'll actually go bad. So there weren't any significant differences in wax or honey production between the full foundation and half foundation. And that basically means that each foundation can be divided to cut the cost of production in half. Most of the nectar collection was done in the first 4 weeks of production. And then after that, it kind of starts to go down. And then nectar collection was similar, but in the no foundation, the nectar was not dried out enough to complete comb honey. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the honey or the nectar is too moist for you to sell it as comb honey. And the time needed to finish these frames would possibly overlap with undesirable nectar sources, like goldenrod, for example, in my area. I don't know if that's similar in other areas. And then Varroa mite treatment thresholds. So about the time, like, you basically need to take comb honey off and then go ahead and treat for Varroa right away. Some of the limitations with my experiment was I did not use management decisions, so rotating or reversing frames may have value in using this because it might have made a difference if I used that when I created my comb honey this year. The length of the experiment is also a limitation because I only have 1 season of data, so there may be more significance between values if I had multiple seasons. And then resources. So liquid honey production decreases the amount of wax needed to produce a product. So once those bees have a liquid honey frame drawn out, all you do is take the top capping off, and then that is all the wax that the bees need to replace next time they go to create it. Comb honey is based off of the ability for bees to draw out and fill wax in 1 season. So it does take a little bit longer. You definitely don't expect your bees to create as much comb honey as they would liquid honey. I want to say it takes 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. And so it's more like costly for the bees to create wax every single time. And it takes them longer to create that product than it would to create liquid honey. So my future plans, I plan to conduct another year of data with UNL research hives, hopefully. I am eventually planning on publishing my findings to the scientific community. And then I will, of course, help the bee lab sell the comb honey that I produce. And here are my references that I used when I created my paper and when I created my proposal. And that is it.
Great job, Shelby. So we already have some questions here. Mike wanted to know if the no foundation treatment meant that it was a naked frame or that there was no starter strip.
Yeah, so there was absolutely no foundation used. I did end up taking, when I went through and did my frame setup, I took melted beeswax and I poured it down the very center strip where the foundation would lie on the top of the frame. I just did that so that the space was filled, and so the bees did have a little bit of a line to start going off of, so they didn't draw it the wrong direction.
Yep, and if you'd like to ask Shelby a question, go ahead and you can unmute yourself, or go ahead and enter chat questions or questions in the chat box.
I have a question, and maybe I missed this at the beginning. Did you monitor hive size or hive populations during the summer, and did they end up being any different?
Yeah, so I actually, every time I would go through and grade my frames, I would also check my populations and like basically how the queen was doing overall. I did have a couple of hives swarm, and I think that was a little bit detrimental to my numbers. And so next year when I plan on doing this again, I'm definitely gonna try and keep that from happening. But I did go ahead and grade the size of the colony. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln Bee Lab has kind of a sheet that they go off of. And so we grade frames of bees, frames of brood, and then resources. And so I went ahead and did that all summer long as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Did you did the populations maintain relatively similar between the hives, or did you see any differences?
Yeah, so aside from when they swarmed, they were all about the same size when I started. I was looking for 12 to 15 frames of bees when I chose the hives that I used for my experiment. They were mostly like 13 or 14 frames of bees.
Great, thanks. Let's see, one other question here in the chat is, how did you fix the half sheet of foundation into the frame?
Okay, so when I do comb honey, I always melt beeswax, and I take a drinking straw and I just kind of dip it in the melted beeswax, and I put my thumb over the end, and then I run it along the top of the frame where the foundation is kept.
Great. Cheryl asks, so perhaps using a half sheet of wax on each frame may save the beekeeper some time and money without reducing comb production. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, so that's kind of what my experiment showed. The comb honey production between the full foundation and the half foundation was not significantly different when I went ahead and ran the numbers. So that was one of the findings that I had with my experiment.
And then Luke is asking, have you ever tried a quarter sheet of foundation?
I have not. I started with this experiment kind of last year, just on my own. I did full foundation and half foundation. I was not, I was not ambitious enough to try the no foundation, but in this case, I needed to in order to justify my findings, because it was kind of the control group.
Yeah, that would be something, Luke, that'd be something interesting to look into if quarter sheet is just as effective as half sheet.
Mhm.
Shelby, someone asked, would a starter strip be considered the same as a half sheet of foundation?
A starter strip? I'm not sure if I know what that is.
It's when they like bead a tiny strip, you know, just a tiny, sometimes they bead wax down, sometimes they cut just a tiny little strip of it.
Yeah, so that's similar to what I did with the no foundation frames, although there wasn't any foundation associated with that. I just filled the gap with wax, if that answers your question.
Rick Block has a question I'm interested in knowing more about. Do you typically just get one super of comb honey per hive? Or, I mean, how many supers can you throw on there?
So I usually stick with one just because it takes the bees so much time to get done. Although this year, I actually, a couple of the hives that I had in production for this experiment had most of their frames drawn out by the second week. So the first time I went out and collected data, they were almost done with the super. So it kind of just depends on how strong your hive is. I was really surprised that that had happened, and I probably should have been keeping data every week, but you don't know until you try it. If you had a really, really strong colony, you could probably do 2 boxes. But it really just depends.
And your setup, if I remember correctly, is just one deep and one super?
Mm-hmm. All of the hives that I had in this experiment were in 2 deeps when I started my experiment June 1st. So up until that point, they had two brood chambers, and then supers if they needed extra space. But they were all taken from 2 brood chambers into 1.
You've got a lot of other questions. Let's
Yeah.
see. So they wanted to know if you did any economic analysis, revenue less cost of the foundation or added cost of labor, substantial differences between, you know, that economic analysis portion.
Yeah, so I would honestly have to say, like, I haven't officially ran the numbers,
But you
but
plan to.
I plan to. And when I was doing the half foundation versus the no foundation, I feel like it took me about the same amount of time, because when I did my half foundation, I just took the foundation and folded it in half, and that's how I halved it. So it wasn't measuring or anything like that.
Yep, and one thing I should mention that Shelby didn't have a chance to talk about in her presentation is that she does have a second UCare. It's a phase 2 of this plan. So the first plan was the field demonstration to see how effective she could produce comb. Do you want to talk about your second phase?
Yeah, so my second UCare, I kind of mentioned it a little bit. It's an academic UCare that I have basically a year to do, and it's actually coming up in April. It's due by, but I'm basically looking at what size of comb honey is the most efficient for beekeepers to sell in order to make a profit. So which one is the most economically beneficial, and which one is something
Going
that
off the cells.
consumers are looking for. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for that experiment, I'm doing 3 different sizes. I have the 1 pound box, like what you would buy off of Man Lake. And then I have a 2-ounce, it's kind of like a little square Ziploc container. And then bite-sized combs that I would typically sell at like State Fair. But when I cut my comb honey, I have these clear plastic, what are they called? They're basically the exact size that I need.
They're condiment containers.
Huh?
Condiment
no.
containers.
I
Is it
meant the templates.
Oh, yes. Yeah, the cut comb templates. Yep.
So I have a piece of plexiglass that I had cut specifically to fit the comb honey box. And then I just have these little thin, cheapy knives that I use to cut it with. And so that way I know they're all the right size. I have that for my small comb. And then bite size is basically whatever is left. Whatever capped honey is left on the frame that I didn't put into the 2 other sizes.
There was a question regarding that size. I'm sorry, I'm jumping questions here, but Mike had a question about measuring the thickness of the comb because some of that 4x4 comb weighs 12 ounces and some weigh 20 ounces.
So when I sell my comb honey, I label the 1-pound box as 12 ounces because legally, if it's less than that weight, I can get in trouble. But typically customers don't complain if it's over that weight, if somebody happened to measure it. So if it's labeled as 12 ounces and it happens to be 20 ounces of product, nobody's going to complain.
And Chris had asked, they didn't hear whether you mixed the treatment frames with the full foundation frames and if it made a difference in production.
So in order to test my hypothesis, I actually took all 10 of my boxes and they had a different order of frames for each because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't the actual place in the box that made a difference, but it was the foundation amount, if that makes any sense.
And then Jamie wanted to know, do you think that starting earlier in the season would affect your results?
It might. When I got started keeping bees and I did my first batch of comb honey, my mentor who had done it before told me that I needed to start June or July. And it's basically just whenever your really heavy nectar flow happens because you want those bees to have enough resources in order to draw out that wax. And so that's usually when a lot of I think it's the linden trees around Ord start to bloom. And so that's why I started my experiment at that point in time.
Yeah, and great point because even in a location, blooms tend to change from year to year and season to season. So watching for honey flow is a good sign. Another question was, did you freeze the comb?
Yes. Before I cut it, I froze it. I actually did that right away. Then I did my last grading where I was harvesting the comb, basically cutting it. I did take final weights on the comb, so I don't think we ever put that into my experiment data, but I do have that information.
Yeah, and that would be a good good way to look and see if there were differences in weight and to see if there is a difference between the thickness of those frames there, but you had 10 frames in there squished as far as possible. So there shouldn't be a whole lot of wiggle room for any extra weight on. Then we have a question about, do you remember honeycomb cereal?
Actually, I think I do.
Randall shaking his head.
Yeah.
Shelby, You
I
had
have a
another
question.
question from Michael. Would your best guess be that if we had an early spring, you would use no foundation, and if we had a late spring, half foundation?
I guess I'd never really thought about incorporating that into my data collection, but it might make a difference if the bees have a longer period of nectar flow or a good nectar flow to produce that comb. It might still be viable that way. And again, it just kind of goes back to my data only having one season. I might see a difference if I have 2 seasons of data because there's more numbers to look at that way.
Jude, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sure.
This is Mike. Back to my thickness thing. The reason I asked that wasn't so much for selling it to the public, was more from the production end. When I do mine, I usually will put my foundation or my frame between 2 already established frames, just to help them keep it straight and all that. And I was just curious that when you have your whole hive in there, does it get wanky? You know, how do you measure that?
So I didn't really have a way of measuring that. I took pictures of all of the frames as I went through the season. Every single time I took data, which I have like 1,200 pictures of just frames on my phone now. But surprisingly, I only had one box that had a little bit of wonky comb. And I think that was because it was one of the hives that probably could have done 2 boxes. I think they were just so gung-ho about it that they collected so much nectar, and they basically took the one drawn bottled honey frame that I had in there and they drew it out really, really thick. And so it actually went into each frame on either side of it. And so it kind of messed it up when I took it out of the box. But that's really the only defects that I've seen, even with the no foundation. But that's kind of why I took all 3 treatments and put them in the same box, is because I never had more than one frame that didn't have foundation.
Did you run into more labor when you had T3 frames next to each other? For example, if you started with a whole box of each T1, T2, T3, I would believe you would come up with a big difference.
Yeah, so that's probably something that I will eventually need to test, is what they would do if there was a full box of each. But theoretically, if you were planning on doing the least amount of foundation that you could do without, significantly decreasing production, you could do no foundation, half foundation, and alternate that, because it didn't seem like there was a difference when I set up the frames that way. I didn't have boxes that only had those 2 treatments in them, but it looks like if there's just a little bit of foundation, it might keep them from drawing it out all wonky.
Is a queen excluder a must for comb honey?
I would actually have to say yes. So liquid honey, it kind of makes a difference between the beekeeper, but with you only producing 1 box of comb honey and having the bees so squished into the one brood chamber, I would highly recommend it, because if a queen gets up in your comb honey, then you have eggs in your product, and then they don't fill that with honey. They raise brood in it instead. Plus the fact that if they do raise brood in your comb honey wax, it tastes kind of bitter and nasty. And so you really don't want to be selling that product.
Do you think doing an entire hive with, say, half foundation could affect the aspect of burr comb and wacky comb?
It might. I really didn't see any wonky comb when there was, say, a no foundation with a half foundation. So it might just be that they need something to start out with on either side. I don't know if I had a way of gauging this numerically, but I kind of saw during my experiment that they would skip the no foundation frames and they would work on the full foundation or the half foundation first, and then they would go back to the no foundation frames, which I could probably see that in the pictures that I took, which is why I did take those pictures throughout my experiment. But I don't think there was ever a way that I could numerically justify that, if that makes any sense.
Someone asked, what Woo Smart pesticide-free foundation are you using?
What?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, there's no such thing as foundation-free or pesticide-free foundation anymore, because even the cleanest operations can't prevent bees from bringing in chemicals. And the foundation wax that is being commercially made comes from wax capping. So while the insecticides are quite low in those kinds of foundations, you do still see some fungicide residues in those. So the idea isn't to be completely pesticide free, but to mitigate accumulation of chemicals in your hive.
Chris wants to know, did they get honeybound with one deep, or were you checking so often that they weren't likely to swarm?
I don't think I took any frames of honey out of the deep. They were mainly working on the foundation. I did start to see some overcrowding issues later on in my experiment, and a couple of my hives I actually didn't catch it in time. So they did swarm on me, and that basically took care of their problem on their own. They did have to requeen, and so that kind of slowed production down for a little bit. I've got 2 hives that the numbers, they were really, really good, and then they kind of stalled. And I think those were probably the hives that they swarmed, is because they didn't have the population to keep building the comb like they were.
Wouldn't it stand to reason that since you're doing comb honey, that any extra honey that or nectar that they're bringing in, that's used for wax production? So it wouldn't necessarily plug up the brood nest like you would if you're doing liquid honey. They're using it all for wax production, and then they're storing the nectar in there.
That would make sense, because if you think about it, it takes 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. So even though they're full, they're using that to create wax scales, and then they're using that to draw out the frames. And so it's kind of condensing the energy per se with whatever nectar that they're producing.
What's your best estimate of time needed for the no comb frames to have been finished?
I probably would have started them. Again, it depends on your nectar flow, but if you have nectar, good nectar in, say, like middle of June, middle of June, I'd probably give those an extra 2 weeks, or even an extra month if that's what's blooming in your area.
Someone said, the more I think about your study, it appears that mathematically each of your hives only had the equivalent of 9 half sheets. So 3T1, 3T2, 3T3s. And accordingly, it does not seem right to conclude the same number of bees could handle 9 T3 frames versus 9 T2 frames or 9 T1 frames. Is that correct? That was a lot.
Yeah, would you repeat that?
They said, the more I think about your study, it appears that mathematically each of your hives only had the equivalent of 9 half sheets. You had 3 T1s, 3 T2s, and 3 T3s, but you had 10 frames, correct? Or no?
Yes, so all of my boxes had 10 frames, but 9 of them were my treatment. I had one drawn out bottled honey frame in there just to get the bees like interested in the box. Plus it evened out my numbers when I did my experiment frames.
They
So
said, sorry, go ahead.
so they were asking about the equivalent of the sheets of wax in each hive.
Pretty much, I think.
Yeah, so this is where we get kind of deep into the science of things, because if we're looking at the frame, then the frame is kind of what Shelby was looking at rather than the colony. If she wants to look at a colony level and put all one colony with one treatment, that's another whole set of different questions. But yeah, I think that what the question was is, can the same amount of bees that worked your methodology with all 3 types in one colony do the same work as if they were in a super with absolutely no foundation or half foundation or full foundation?
That's a really good question.
It's a separate question, but really good.
It's a separate question. I don't know if they could or not. That I honestly don't know. It would be something that I would have to test.
But that midrib of
I would say
foundation
if I
really
was
doesn't make that much wax. I mean, weight wise, that's really not that much wax. It's just a guide more than anything.
Yeah, weight wise, it's not a whole lot, but it's time wise. How long does it take those bees to produce the foundation it needs to build those cells? It's an interesting question. We could look at that too coming this summer, is, you know, repeat your methodology, but also have a few colonies with just single type treatments and look at their productivity. We tried to avoid that in the first place because of the wanky comb situation and the fear that we were going to have to destroy a lot of burr comb that wasn't going to give her good data. So this was a first step, but those are great ideas. Maybe we can think more about setting up a few more hives for you.
Mm-hmm.
Are your hives all level? I mean, talking about wanky comb, that's probably the biggest detriment to straight comb, is not having your hives level.
Oh, you mean like elevation wise, like having them like that?
Right. More side to side than front to back.
I'd say that my hives are all pretty level, although I don't know if that makes a difference or not. Management wise, if I was just doing a no foundation box on my own for my business, I would probably start it early and give them sugar syrup to get started on the wax. And then once the nectar flow started, I'd probably take the sugar syrup off, just so they kind of have a little bit of a head start. I wouldn't probably do that in my experiment just because that's an extra variable, but if I were doing it on my own, that's what I would personally do.
As someone who doesn't, who I haven't made cut comb honey before or tried to sell it, could you talk a little bit about the different sizes of cut comb and what sort of prices you're able to sell those at in Nebraska?
Yeah, so usually commercially, I would say like Man Lake and other suppliers, they only really sell like 2 sizes of boxes. And so one would be a square 1 pound, and then they might have like a skinny 1/2 pound. I kind of went off of that, and I have a very small comb. I actually might have some if I went and looked, but they're just Ziploc containers I buy from Walmart, and they're like inch by inch pieces. That's like maybe 4 bites. But I found that people that don't know what comb honey is, they will buy one of those over a 1 pound, and they will take it back for their families to try. And that's kind of the same thing with the bite-sized, is it's just a cheap little thing that kids can buy with $1. And it's like honey sticks, kind of. You know, I was really looking forward to the Nebraska State Fair, because that's where I sold a lot of bite-sized combs last year. And as far as pricing goes, I wholesale them for 50 cents a piece, and I retail them for $1. So.
And how much is a pound of cut comb? Is that $15?
Yes, so I've been recommending that people retail it at $15, and I wholesale it for 10. But I have had businesses that have marked it closer to $20 and have done okay with that as well. I just think that there's not many people that produce it. And like I said, the large commercial beekeepers focus on liquid honey, and smaller commercial beekeeper or smaller beekeepers, they usually do bottled honey as well. So if people put in a little bit of extra time and work and they create comb honey, it's more of a diversified product. And the people that know what it is really, really seek it out. Did you try foundation attached to the bottom of the frame instead of the top? All of mine were attached to the top because it basically hung down off of the frame where I attached it with beeswax. I don't know if it'd work to attach it to the bottom or not, just because it kind of flops around.
How established should a hive be to attempt comb honey? Should a first-year hive avoid it?
So it really depends on your hive. I would suggest using established hives, although that was what I set my first hives up with when I got packages. I did start with some drawn wax when I started my packages, so that definitely made a difference my first year. But if you're starting out with naked foundation and you're trying to get those bees to draw out the brood frames and the honey super you're planning on using for the first year, just to give them food for the winter, I wouldn't recommend it. Usually you don't expect honey your first year.
Shelby, did you have anything crazy happen during your experiment?
Yeah, so the hives, there was 2 hives I think that swarmed. I actually checked them on the day that the queens were hatching. So I caught a bunch of queens, and with the remainder of the hives that I had that weren't in my experiment, I split some of those and I put virgin queens from the colonies that I caught them out of, to make nukes, kind of mating nukes, if you know.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's actually happened to me several times since I started keeping bees. I just have great timing, I guess.
Somebody said, as for pricing, we use $1 for the box plus $1 per ounce for each ounce of cut comb in the box. This avoids legal issues of placing the correct net weight. Too little cheats the buyer and too much cheats the seller and the bees, and could get in trouble with weight loss, folks.
Yeah, so in order to sell, like I have a licensed commercial kitchen that I use when I produce my comb honey. And in order for other people to be able to sell my product, I legally have to have a net weight on my box. So I do undercut myself sometimes, but that's for the safety of my business and for myself. So I'm still selling it as if it is a 1 pound box of comb, but my weight says 12 ounces in case that comb is skinnier. And that's kind of up to the buyer to decide, well, this one doesn't have quite as much in it, and to pick out the best one. It's like picking fruit or vegetables from the market, you know?
And then I think we missed the question earlier about the weight of the small bites. Do you know roughly what the weight value of those are? Okay.
Nope, I kind of just, I cut whatever is left up into little pieces so that it's a mouthful and a taste, and that's about it.
Wonderful. And I think she also made a note that if you're selling in Lincoln or Omaha, you could probably increase by 1/3 to half your price. And then Jamie wanted to mention that he loves this type of research. It's practical and useful, and we're getting lots of thanks, Shelby. You did a great job. Thanks again, Shelby. If you could just put your chat, if you put some kind of contact information, if you've got your Facebook or social media handle, or if you don't mind sharing your email, I'm sure people would love to connect with you directly about some more of those questions.
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that.
That's a really good question. How do you avoid eating all of your small bites?
When I cut comb honey, I take little pieces here and there, and by the time I'm done with it, it's kind of like baking a bunch of cookies or something. You eat so much, you're kind of done.
Shelby, did you talk about the fact that you do your cut combs in mediums, so you have extra along the bottom to do your small bites and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I guess when I started keeping bees, I didn't have shallows and I didn't want an extra set of equipment. So I just went ahead and set up medium foundation or medium frames with natural foundation. And so that A, gives me extra comb honey if they end up creating a full frame. And it B, gives me a chance to kind of pick and choose where I cut. It's not quite so strict when I go ahead and try to harvest. So if there was maybe something that happened up at the top of the frame, I can move my template down a little bit and I still have room to work. Otherwise, it'd just be kind of throwaway, or you put it into small combs and that kind of thing.
Great. And then there was a question about, could you show that picture of that tiny bite? And then we're going to have to kind of end the session shortly here. So let's wrap it up. But I think that, yeah, it would be great to show that photo or slide of the small bites again. And then let's think. I'm sorry?
I don't know if I had a slide on it, but I probably have some sitting around here because I've been selling them. So I'm sure I can find one quick. I did put my Facebook and my email address in the chat. Basically, this is just my little bite size, and I get these condiment cups from Sam's Club, and there's like 500 of them for 10 bucks or so, and you have to buy the lids separate, but it cost me like 3 cents to make these, and you can sell them for $1. So making the most out of your frames, that's a really good management decision when you go to cut your comb honey. And then I think I do have a small box. Just give me a second.
While she does that, I just want to remind folks that we're going to be doing our next Hap-BEE hour for February, and I think that that'll be the first Friday of February, which is February 5th. So just remember that. All right, Shelby.
Yeah, so this is my little Ziploc container that I use. And then I just put labels on the sides. I use, I heat seal all of my products, and I've found that I can't say off the top of my head what size it is, but it fits a pint jar and it goes around these little square ones perfectly. But well,
Judy, this Mr. Width here again. I think part of the thing in the back of my mind on the width of the comb as they build it is I just read something recently. I think that bees will use the resources they have. So they may build out that full sheet wider and not do as much to that no foundation sheet next to it. So I think that'd be something really interesting to track.
Yeah, agreed. Stay tuned for next time because Shelby's going to rerun this experiment this summer and we might incorporate some of these new ideas. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. And thanks, Shelby, again. She is, again, an undergraduate student at UNL. And so I just want to highlight how impressive this young woman is. If you want to see her talk again, she is going to be presenting Tuesday at the second Tuesday seminar for MBA next week. And maybe we can just throw that information up there. Or it's on Facebook. Yes, look at, yeah. So
Look at
thank you.
Nebraska Beekeepers Association, the events on there.
Thank you, everybody.
Great job, Shelby.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shelby.